I now recognize the member for Cowichan Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start, as I speak about Bill 19, the COVID-19 Related Measures Act. I'm actually very much appreciating the debate and the discussion that's happening in the chamber today. I think, as the member for Vancouver, Langara, pointed out, there is a very significant role that we as elected representatives have to uphold and protect our public institutions. And the discussion around today's bill has centered to some degree on that role and that expectation. And I think it's very important at times like this, when we talk about delegating powers, about where powers are going to end up, about the legislative versus the executive decision-making powers, that we need to ensure that we are engaged in very effective debate and discussion about this. The Minister for Public Safety also talked about how the Emergency Program Act has been underway in a rewriting that's been undergoing for some time now, and that today's bill is not in any way a final say on where the Emergency Program Act will end up. And I think that it's important to step back a little bit at this point to talk about the rewriting of the Emergency Program Act, which, as the Public Safety Minister pointed out, is an old act out of the Emergency War Measures Act. Because we are in a time in history where we are actually going to see increasing numbers of emergencies. Not just the natural disasters that the Minister for Public Safety spoke to, earthquakes and things like that, which we have no control over, but that we are going to see increasing numbers of emergencies because of our actions as humans on this planet. And so we've seen historic fire seasons in British Columbia, several in the last number of years. We are seeing flooding events that are unprecedented. And we know that these disasters are very much related to climate change and the impacts of climate change. And right now, we are in the midst of a global pandemic, COVID-19, which is yet another zoonotic disease that has emerged in our global community, along with SARS and MERS and Ebola, all of which are zoonotic diseases which have transferred from animals to humans. And the epidemiologists have been for many years identifying that we've indeed created conditions that make these diseases more prevalent. And I think that in the midst of this pandemic, yes, we have to focus on the very serious issues that we are facing today as a result of the pandemic. We also have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to avoid what has become an increasingly sped up process of seeing the emergence of these diseases, which are very serious and could become more serious. And that there is also an intersection between these zoonotic diseases and climate change. And so we are actually looking at conditions that humans have created that are making our world and our societies more frail and challenging. And so, of course, we need to be looking at our Emergency Program Act here in British Columbia. And we have to constantly be asking ourselves, how do we balance our capacity to deal with emergencies with our absolute commitment to ensuring that our institutions and that democracy is in no way eroded in the course of these emergencies and our responses to them. So Bill 19, the COVID-19 Related Measures Act, is a bill about the nature emergencies that extend beyond a typical state of emergency, the power a government has or may need to have to address these emergencies, and the checks and balances that are placed on these powers. COVID-19 has tested our province and our institutions in fundamental ways. Under a state of emergency, government has had to draw upon sweeping powers that have profound impacts on our communities, our businesses, and the lives of every British Columbian. What's different this time from other emergencies is that there is no clear end point for a pandemic. This is not a fire season with a predictable end. We don't yet know how long a vaccine may take to develop and distribute. We don't know if we will see a second wave necessitating another state of emergency. For this reason, Bill 19 proposes that orders enacted under a state of emergency be able to be extended beyond the end of that state of emergency. This concept is not fundamentally a problem. And while we do not want to remain in a state of emergency for any longer than we have to, it is clear that certain provisions, whether it is social distancing or regulations on the normal function of business and economic life, may need to, in fact, remain in place. However, if we are going to look at expanding these powers, we need to ensure that there are sufficient checks and balances on them. The Ombudsperson's report earlier this week that asked some hard questions about the use of these powers is one of the factors that seems to help necessitate this act. There remain some additional recommendations that so far seem outstanding in this legislation. The larger question that our caucus thinks needs answering is if we are to extend the impact of orders enacted in a state of emergency beyond the end of that state of emergency, what role should the Legislative Assembly play in oversight? Overall, there's been too large of a trend away from ensuring an adequate role for the Legislative Assembly in overseeing the powers of government. And that doesn't just relate to states of emergency. Legislation is passed in here that is enabling legislation, and then government has the power to add the regulations, meaning that those of us who are elected provide power to government, but the limitations and scope of that power is not fully defined. I recognize the need for flexibility and adaptability in a rapidly changing world, but I argue that that flexibility and adaptability must be balanced against transparency and accountability. For this bill, we have a number of questions for the Minister about the limitations and oversight of these powers, and we remain uncertain about whether making a permanent change to the Emergency Program Act is warranted at this time. So while we will be supporting this bill at second reading, given the unprecedented nature of the emergency that we are in, we do have a number of questions about this legislation that we need to understand before we will be able to support it beyond that point. Thank you.